My name is Faye Drummond. I am 31 years old. And for most of my adult life, I believed I was helping my mother survive. I was not helping her survive. I was helping her hide. I want to be precise about that distinction because I spent a long time softening it in my own mind, telling myself she was struggling, telling myself she was overwhelmed, telling myself that the money I sent every month was an act of love and not an act of management. It took me longer than I would like to admit to understand that those two things are not the same. Love gives freely and knows what it is giving. What I was doing had conditions attached that nobody ever told me about, and a ceiling that nobody ever planned to reach. But I am getting ahead of myself. I should start where it actually started, which is not the day I changed the account settings, and not the Friday morning the cards declined, and not even the afternoon my father called me sounding like a man who had just opened a door he did not know existed in his own house. I should start in the kitchen of my parents' home in Maplewood, New Jersey, on the second Sunday of October 2017, when I was 24 years old and had just accepted my first real job offer, and my mother looked at me across the breakfast table and smiled the way she always did when she had already decided something. I had graduated from Rutgers in May of that year with a degree in accounting. I had passed my first CPA exam section in August. I would clear all 4 sections by the following June, and I had accepted a position as a staff accountant at a mid-sized firm in Newark called Hargrove and Slade. The starting salary was $54,200. I was proud of it. I had worked 3 part-time jobs through most of college to keep my student loans manageable, and I had done it without asking my parents for much beyond a place to sleep during summers. A campus job in the library from 8 a.m. to noon. A dinner shift at a pizza place on Route 1 3 nights a week. A weekend gig doing data entry for a property management office in New Brunswick that paid $14.50 an hour. I built my own financial life quietly and early, which is maybe why what my mother asked me to participate in felt, at first, like a natural extension of that. Like I was simply applying my capacity to help where it was needed. My mother's name is Renata. She is 61 years old now, and she has always been a woman who moves through the world as though the details are beneath her, the bills, the logistics, the paperwork, the actual mechanics of how things get paid for. My father, Gerald, handled all of that. He was an estimator for a commercial construction company in Morris County for 30 years. Quiet, methodical, the kind of man who kept every receipt in a manila folder sorted by month, who balanced the checkbook on the last Sunday of every month with a pencil and a yellow legal pad. He was not the kind of man who missed things. Which is part of why it took me so long to understand what my mother had built. She had built it in the one space he could not see, the private channel of a separate name on a separate account at a separate institution. She had been careful. She had been patient. And she had waited until I was earning before she asked me to step in. That Sunday morning in October, my mother set down her coffee cup and said, "Now that you're earning, I want to talk to you about something." She said it lightly, the way she always introduced things that were not light at all. She explained that she had a credit card, just one, she said, that she had opened a few years earlier for personal expenses. My father managed the household accounts, she said, and she had always felt that she deserved a small measure of financial independence. The card had accumulated a balance.
Not enormous, she said.
But she would appreciate it if I could make the minimum payments for a few months while she sorted herself out. The balance, she told me that morning, was $4,300. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I was 24, and she was my mother, and she had asked me in the tone of voice that did not leave much room for no. Before I tell you what happened after that first payment, I want to ask you something. Tell me, what is the weather like where you are right now? Is it raining, or is the sky the kind of flat gray that can't decide what it wants to do? I ask because what I am about to describe is the kind of story that feels like that kind of sky. Not a storm, just a gray that you keep thinking will resolve itself, and doesn't, and then one day you look up and realize you have been standing in it for years. The first payment I made was on November 3rd, 2017. I transferred $214 to a card in my mother's name on a Citibank account she gave me the login credentials for. She thanked me warmly. She made my favorite dinner that weekend, chicken marsala with the wide egg noodles she knew I liked. Everything felt fine. By February of 2018, the minimum payment had risen to $309. I asked her about it, and she said she'd had some unexpected dental work. She showed me a receipt from a periodontist in Summit for $1,140. I did not ask to see the card statement. I was 24 years old, and she was my mother, and I believed her. By September of 2018, the minimum payment was $431 a month. I asked again, more carefully this time, noting that the balance didn't seem to be decreasing. She said the card carried a high interest rate, and she was working on transferring the balance to something with a lower APR. She seemed mildly annoyed that I was asking. I felt embarrassed for having asked. What I did not know, what I had no reason to suspect because I had only ever been given access to a single login for a single card, was that there were 3 other cards. I would not know this for years. I would not know this until a Tuesday evening in January 2024 when I was sitting at the desk in my apartment in Newark, reviewing a client file that had nothing to do with my family. And something in the pattern of what I was looking at made a door open in my mind that I had kept carefully shut for 6 years. But first I have to tell you about the years between, because the years between are where the actual story lives. I moved into my own apartment in January 2019, a 1-bedroom in the ironbound neighborhood of Newark for $1,340 a month. My salary at Hargrove and Slade had grown to $61,800 by then, and I had been promoted to senior staff accountant 11 months ahead of the standard timeline. My supervisor, a precise and generous woman named Patricia Ewan, had told me in my performance review that I had unusual instincts for pattern recognition. She said it was rare in someone at my level. She said she thought I would be a manager within 2 years. I remember sitting across from her in that review and feeling genuinely proud, and then driving home that evening and setting up a new automatic transfer to my mother's card account because the minimum had gone up again to $503, and my mother had left me a voicemail that morning reminding me. That detail stays with me. The same week I was told I had unusually good instincts, I set up a larger automatic payment to an account I had never fully looked at. I do not say this to be hard on myself. I say it because it illustrates something true about how financial exploitation inside families works. It is not that the person being exploited is unaware or incapable. It is that the frame around the situation, the frame of family, of obligation, of daughterhood, is so total that the ordinary instincts don't apply in the same way. You would notice immediately if a stranger asked you to make monthly payments to an account you'd never seen statements for. You would not even consider it. But when it is your mother, and she is standing in her kitchen in the house you grew up in, and she is asking you in a voice that has been asking things of you your entire life, the instincts that protect you everywhere else go quiet. My mother's payments had become a fixed line in my monthly budget the same way rent and utilities were fixed. I had stopped thinking of them as temporary around month 8. My mother had stopped calling them temporary around month 5. What she called them now, when she called them anything at all, was your contribution to the family. She said it the way she might say your room or your car, as though it had always been mine to give, and she had simply formalized the arrangement. In the spring of 2019, 3 weeks before my 26th birthday, I asked if we could sit down together and look at the full statement, not to audit her, I said carefully, just to understand the payoff timeline. She deflected with warmth. She said she appreciated everything I was doing, and she didn't want me to worry about the mechanics of it. You just keep doing what you're doing, she said, and I'll handle the rest. I let it go. I wanted to let it go. In March of 2020, during the first weeks of the pandemic lockdown, I asked again. I was working from home and had more time to think than was probably good for me, and I had been running numbers quietly in the back of my mind for months. I asked if she could forward me the most recent statement, just so I could see the interest rate and evaluate whether there was a smarter structure for paying it down. She said she would send it. She did not. I asked again in April. She said she'd been busy with everything going on. I asked a third time in May, and she said, her voice cooling precisely by a few degrees, I don't understand why you need to audit me, Faye. I'm your mother, not a client. I let it go. I was 27, and the world was frightening that spring, and I did not want to be the person who made things harder. In June of 2021, I was promoted to manager at Hargrove and Slade. My salary became $84,300. My mother called to congratulate me and said she was proud, and the call was warm and ordinary, and for a few days after it I felt good about everything. That same week, the automatic transfer I had set up for her card payment was returned with a message that the account number was no longer valid. My mother called me 2 days later with a new account number. Briskly, efficiently, as though she were updating a utility. I wrote down the new number. I set up a new transfer. The new minimum payment was $612. I did not think to ask why the account number had changed. I was 30 years old, and she was my mother, and I had been doing this for 4 years, and by that point the question I should have asked had been buried under the accumulated weight of not having asked it all those other times. The third account number came in August of 2022, again delivered by voicemail, again as though it were routine. The minimum payment by then was $734. I updated the transfer. I did not ask. The fourth account number arrived in a text message in April of 2023. The minimum payment was $819. There was no explanation in the text, just the routing number and account number and a single line. New card. Same deal. I stared at that message for longer than I should have. Same deal. As though we had a deal. As though this was a contract I had signed. I set up the transfer. I did not ask. It was not until January of 2024 that I finally understood what I had been looking at for 6 years. I was reviewing a client's personal financial records as part of a forensic accounting project at work, a case involving undisclosed liabilities in a divorce proceeding. The client's spouse had opened a series of credit cards in a single name over a period of several years, keeping the accounts invisible to the joint financial picture by ensuring the statements went to a separate address and the minimum payments were handled through a separate bank. The balances had grown methodically despite consistent minimum payments because the spending had continued throughout. It was a clean, patient, long-running concealment. My colleague Daniel Ferris and I had been reconstructing the account history for 2 weeks. On a Tuesday evening at 8:47 p.m., I was sitting at my desk looking at a payment ledger we had built for the case, and I noticed that 4 of the client's accounts had changed account numbers midstream. Each time, the new number corresponding to a new card opened at the same institution under a slightly different product line. The balance had never actually transferred. The old card had simply been closed and a new one opened, preserving the concealment while resetting the surface appearance of the situation.
I set down my pen.
I sat very still for what was probably 90 seconds. Then I went home, and I could not sleep. I opened my own bank records at 1:17 a.m. I went back as far as the portal allowed, which was 7 years. I pulled every outgoing transfer I had ever made and sorted them by recipient account. There had been 4 different account numbers, spread across what appeared to be 4 separate institutions. I had not noticed, across all those years, that the numbers were different. I had treated each new one as an update, the way you update a direct deposit when you change jobs. I had never laid them all out side by side. For account numbers. For cards. The same architecture I had been reconstructing professionally for 2 weeks, replicated in my own financial history, built by my own mother, funded by me. I built the spreadsheet in approximately 3 hours. I was careful and thorough, because that is what I am. Total payments made over 6 years and 3 months, from November 2017 through January 2024, $112,340. I looked at that number for a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. The heat clicked on at 3:22 a.m. and startled me. I saved the file, closed the laptop, and went to my bedroom and lay down on top of the covers with my coat still on and stared at the ceiling until 5:45 a.m., when the sky outside the window began to lighten, and I got up and made coffee and started making a list of what to do next. The next morning I called my colleague Daniel Ferris, before 9 a.m. I told him I needed a personal consultation, off the clock, and that I would explain when I saw him. He said yes, without hesitation. We met at a coffee shop on Washington Street at 8:30 a.m. the following day, and I walked him through the spreadsheet on my laptop. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Does your father know about any of these accounts?" I said, "I did not think so." He said, "Faye, these card numbers don't match any institution that would appear on a joint tax return unless she specifically listed them. If your dad has been filing jointly and their accountant has been doing the returns, he would have no visibility into these unless she disclosed them separately.
He paused.
Do you know if she files separately? I did not know. I had never thought to ask. Daniel referred me that same afternoon to a financial attorney named Margaret Holst, a partner at a firm on Broad Street in Newark, who he had worked with on 2 previous forensic cases. I called her office at 2:14 p.m. and left a message. She called back at 4:47 p.m. I had an appointment for the following Monday, January 22nd, at 9 a.m. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with my mother 4 days before that appointment, on the evening of January 18th, because it was the last conversation we had in which she still believed nothing had changed. She called me at 7:09 p.m. on a Friday. She said she needed to discuss the February payment. She said the account had been flagged for a late processing fee in December, and as a result, the new minimum had adjusted upward to $743. She relayed this calmly and efficiently, the way she had always relayed these things, as though she were reading from a bill, and I were a service provider receiving an updated invoice. I said, "Mom, I want to talk to you about something first." She waited. I said, "I've been making these payments for over 6 years. I've never seen a full statement on any of the accounts. I want to understand what the actual payoff plan is because I've been doing some math, and I want to make sure I understand what I'm contributing to." The pause that followed was different from her usual pauses. It was not thoughtful. It was calibrating. When she spoke, the warmth had left her voice with a precision that reminded me, not for the first time, of a switch being thrown. She said, "Faye, I don't know what has gotten into you, but I find this line of questioning frankly insulting after everything I've done to manage this quietly for both of us. If you had concerns, you had 6 years to raise them." I said, "I'm raising them now." She said, "Your father, and I gave you everything. A stable home, an education, every advantage. Some daughters contribute to their families without making it into an interrogation." I said, "I understand." A pause. "I need to think about the February payment." She hung up. 6 minutes and 40 seconds later, she called my father. My father called me at 7:43 p.m. He sounded uncomfortable and careful, the way he always sounded when he had been asked to deliver a message he did not fully understand. He said my mother had told him I was considering withdrawing support that the family had come to depend on. He said he didn't want to get in the middle of it, but he hoped I wasn't going to do something I would regret. He said, "She says you have plenty, Faye. She says you've always had more than enough." I told my father I loved him. I told him I would call him soon. I hung up and sat very still on my couch for a long time, and something inside me went completely quiet. Not numb, not angry, but settled, the way a room settles when a window finally closes after years of low wind coming through it. I had been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, for exactly this moment. For the moment when the frame became visible. When what had been presented to me as love revealed its actual structure, which was leverage. I met with Margaret Holst on January 22nd at 9 a.m. Her office was orderly and her manner was direct, and within 20 minutes of sitting across from her I understood why Daniel had recommended her. She reviewed the spreadsheet line by line. She noted that all 4 cards were in my mother's name alone, that I had been listed on none of them as an authorized user or co-signer, and that under New Jersey law the payments I had made constituted voluntary gifts with no legally enforceable continuation. She said it clearly. I had no obligation, past, present, or future. She also said, with the same directness, that if my father was unaware of the full scope of these accounts, he might have cause to consult a family law attorney about the implications for their joint marital estate. She said that was not my concern to manage or initiate, but it was information I was now carrying, and she wanted me to understand its weight. I asked her one question before I left. I said, "If I stop the payments, can she compel me to continue in any way?" Margaret said, "No, she cannot." She said it without any qualifiers. I thanked her, took the elevator to the lobby, walked to my car, and sat in the parking garage for 22 minutes looking at the concrete pillar in front of me. Then I drove to work. I billed 4 hours that afternoon without difficulty. The numbers were very clear. I did not stop the payments immediately. I spent the next 2 weeks organizing everything, every transfer, every account number, every date, every amount, compiled into a single PDF with a clean table of contents and a summary page at the front. I printed 2 copies and kept them in separate locations. I was not planning for a confrontation. I was planning the way I always plan, which is methodically and without drama, because the work itself has always been the thing I trust most. On February 6, 2024, at 11:23 p.m., I logged into my banking portal and canceled all 4 automatic transfers. The interface asked me to confirm each cancellation separately. I confirmed each one. The process took 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I know this because I watched the clock in the lower right corner of my screen. 6 years and 3 months of monthly payments ended in just under 5 minutes on a Wednesday night in February. I did not message my mother. I did not call. I made a cup of chamomile tea, drank it standing at the kitchen counter, and went to bed at 11:34 p.m. I slept for 8 hours and 20 minutes. It was the longest uninterrupted sleep I had had in weeks. The first card declined on Friday, February 8th, at 11:02 a.m. I know this because my mother called me at 11:17 a.m. Her voice was controlled in the way that required visible effort to maintain. She said there appeared to be an issue with the city payment. Had something changed on my end? I said the automatic payment had been removed. She said, very quietly, I need you to put it back, Faye. I said, I'm not going to do that. A long pause. Then, do you understand what you are doing to this family? I said, I think I do. She said, you are going to destroy everything over money. I said, Mom, I have paid $112,000 over 6 years to 4 credit card accounts that Dad has never seen a statement for. If there is something being destroyed, I did not build it. She hung up. The second card declined on February 11th. The third on February 14th, Valentine's Day, which I noticed and did not remark on to anyone. The fourth on February 17th. I received calls from my mother on each of those days. I did not answer any of them. By the evening of the 17th, I had 11 voicemails. I waited 3 weeks before I listened to them. On a Saturday morning in early March, I made a full pot of coffee, sat at my kitchen table in the gray morning light, and played them in order from oldest to newest, as though listening to a single continuous document. The first 3 were controlled and cold, variations on how I had made a selfish and short-sighted decision, and she expected me to correct it. The fourth was warmer and more bewildered, as though she had reconsidered her approach. The fifth and sixth asked me to call her back. The seventh began with, Faye, your father is starting to ask me questions. The eighth was crying, not theatrical crying, but the quieter, more private kind, the kind that sounds like someone who is genuinely frightened. The ninth asked me again to call. The 10th said my father had found something in the mail. The 11th said, very quietly, Faye, please. I don't know how to explain this to him. I sat with that last one for a while after it ended. Then I washed my coffee cup and got dressed and went for a walk. My father called me on Saturday, February 15th, at 2:34 p.m., 3 days after the second card declined, and while the third and fourth were still pending. He had found a credit card statement in the household mail, addressed to my mother, from an institution called Synchrony Bank. He said he had not recognized the return address and had opened it without thinking. The balance on that card alone was $23,700. He said, Faye, what is this? It was not phrased as a question. I told him about the spreadsheet. I told him about Margaret Holst. I told him, as carefully and as factually as I could manage, that I had been making payments on 4 credit cards in my mother's name for 6 years and 3 months, that I had done it because she had asked me to and because I had believed it was temporary, and that the total I had transferred, not the remaining balance but what I personally had paid, was $112,340. I told him I had documentation going back to November 2017. I told him I would send him the PDF. He did not speak for a long time. Through the phone, I could hear the ordinary sounds of his house on a Saturday afternoon. The refrigerator, something on television in another room, the quality of silence that belongs to a house where a person is absorbing something very large. He said, "When did this start?" I said, "She opened the first account in 2015. She asked me to start paying in October 2017. He said, "How many cards?" I said, "4. He said, "I need to call you back." He called back at 6:18 p.m. He had spoken with my mother. He said he had called Robert Chin, their accountant of 17 years, and asked him to pull every joint return filed since 2015. He said he wanted to understand the full picture before he made any decisions. He said he was not angry with me. He said it 3 times across the conversation, in 3 different contexts, as though he needed to establish it firmly before he could move on to the rest. He sounded like a man who had been standing in a room for 34 years and had just learned the dimensions were different from what he thought. I was not part of what happened next between my parents. That was correct, and I understood it to be correct. Some processes are not mine to manage, even when I set them in motion. What I know is that Robert Chin referred my father to a family law attorney named Stephen Park on February 26, and that Stephen Park's paralegal contacted Margaret Holst's office on March 1 to request the documentation I had already compiled. Margaret called me that same afternoon to confirm I was comfortable sharing it. I said yes. My father called me on March 4, 2024, at 6:55 p.m. The call was short.
He said he wanted to thank me.
He said he understood that what I had done without intending to cause harm to him specifically, that I had simply stopped doing something I had never been obligated to do. He said he needed to have known. He said it exactly like that. Not, "I'm glad I know now." Not, "I wish you had told me sooner." He said, "I needed to have known." As though knowledge itself was a resource that had been withheld from him, the same way money had been withheld from me, or rather, redirected away from where it was meant to go and towards something that was never disclosed. I think about that phrase still. Needed to have known. As though there are categories of information that are not neutral, that have a weight and a moral character of their own. Maybe they do. I do not speak to my mother now. That is not a statement of drama. It is simply the current condition. She called me 4 times between March and April, the last time on April 3 at 8:22 p.m. What she said in that last voicemail was, "You had more than enough. I never asked you for a single thing you couldn't give." And she was right in the narrowest possible sense. I had enough. I could give it. Every dollar was mine to send. But there is a difference between capacity and consent, and between giving and being extracted from, and between a contribution and a concealment, and I am 31 years old, and I am an accountant, and I understand the difference now in a way I could not when I was 24 and sitting across from her at a breakfast table on a Sunday morning in October. Some things only cost what they cost when someone finally adds them up. That was always going to be my job. There is a particular quality to the quiet that follows a decision like mine. It is not the comfortable quiet of a resolved thing. It is the quiet of a window finally closed against whether you had stopped noticing because you had lived inside it for so long. The air feels different. You are not sure at first whether you prefer it. And then, after some time, you realize that what you prefer is simply being able to feel the difference. To know the weather for what it is. I reviewed a case study recently as part of a continuing education requirement for my CPA license on the subject of financial exploitation within family systems. The research noted that such exploitation persists not because the person being exploited lacks the capability to recognize it, but because the relational framing, the language of family, obligation, love, and gratitude, suppresses the evaluative instincts that would otherwise activate. The exploitation is presented as care. The payments are framed as gifts. The person paying is positioned as the one who would be ungrateful for questioning the arrangement. If you are ever asked to make regular payments toward accounts whose statements you have never seen, the first recommendation from any financial attorney will be simple: request full documentation before the next payment is made. Not because you distrust the person asking, but because trust was never meant to be a substitute for information. That is not a cynical position. It is just an accurate one. If you were in Faye's position, if you had spent 6 years paying your mother's hidden credit cards and you finally had the spreadsheet in front of you, and she was calling to say a card had declined, would you have answered that call and told her everything you knew? Or would you have let it ring, the way Faye did, and waited for the statements to say what words between the two of you never quite could? This channel is for entertainment and personal reflection. Names and identifying details have been changed. If you're experiencing financial coercion within your family, please consult a qualified attorney.